Get started. The last few people come in. Well, good evening everybody and welcome to our FoLA meeting, and tonight represents another first for us. It's the first time we've had a FoLA meeting in the Magill Church, and there is significance in being here tonight, and you'll hear more about that from our guest speaker afterwards. The meeting is being live streamed, and thank you to Gabriel and to James up there by the look of it, who are controlling all that for us tonight. And we'll have a couple of announcements first. Firstly, thank you to you all who were here at our meeting last month to support the constitution of FoLA. A lot has happened since our last meeting, and we had to adopt it as part of the process. Since then, it's been approved by the Consumer and Business Services Department of the South Australian Government, which administers the Associations and Corporation Act, and we're an incorporated body. It's also been approved by ACNC in Canberra, the body that sort of controls charities and not-for-profit organisations. We've also been covered by LCA Insurance for the first time, and so all of that sort of stuff is done and dusted now. It will mean that instead of our annual meeting being in October, the financial year now will close at the 31st of December, as does our membership registration list. And our annual meeting will be held sometime next year, probably at our March meeting. But we haven't finally decided that yet, but that's what we're aiming for. So things will change a little bit as a result of that, but hopefully it'll make it more streamlined, particularly for our treasurer. So it was a mammoth project really, and for those of us involved very closely with it, it took almost 2 years to get it completed. So that's one thing out of the way. Now I'll ask Lois to speak a bit about our next meeting.
Right, so welcome to you all. Glad to see you found your way to this unusual venue for us. But our meeting next month will be back at our usual venue, Emmanuel Church, North Adelaide. That will be our last meeting of the year, the October meeting on Thursday, the 19th of October. And that will be a late celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Overland Telegraph. That is a year late. It will be just about exactly 151 years since the Overland Telegraph was open for business. The first, the greatest infrastructure project in Australia. It transformed communications for Australia, from Australia to the rest of the world. Instead of waiting 3 months for news from Europe, it could arrive here in hours. And of course, it had a huge effect on the life of communities in Central Australia, such as our Hermannsburg mission in Central Australia, which was, and the existence of the Overland Telegraph line in the vicinity was one of the factors that determined the choice of the venue of that mission. So, Richard Venus is our speaker. He was an electrical engineer and then built up a second career as an historian of engineering heritage. He was has been for decades now very deeply involved in that, and has done a remarkable amount of research on the work of the building of the Overland Telegraph, the work of Sir Charles Todd, and the things he had to cope with, and so he's sure to have a really interesting story to tell us. So we look forward to seeing you on Thursday the 19th back in our North Adelaide venue.
Thank you, Lois. Perhaps I'm new to the game here, but there seems to be quite a few faces here that I haven't seen before. So has anybody that hadn't been to a FoLA meeting before? Oh, look at them all. Well, special welcome to you all. And I've also been advised that we're looking at the work of two architects of church facilities, and Lady von Schramek is here tonight. Where? Oh, special welcome to you. So she's the widow of Eric von Schramek, and as you came in tonight, you might have seen some books, published books, on Eric von Schramek, and they're being made available tonight at the discounted price of $20. So if anybody wants one, you can see us supper time afterwards, but that's the book that Helen has just put up there. So we'll be entertained by Chris Burns tonight, and I thought I sort of heard his name before, that he knew me, and he'll speak a bit about the church that I belong to, Nain, and he was the architect of the submission that we put to get heritage listing, and he knocked it back. On many grounds, covering 20 pages, but there's one line that sort of told the full story. And I'm sure he'll tell you more about it. But anyhow, I'll ask Lyle Kupke to come forward and introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you, Lyle.
Right, thank you. I first met Chris Burns a year ago, in May last year, during the History Month. He was giving a talk at the Burnside Uniting Church, and the talk was about the large number of churches that were built in Adelaide in the post-war period. and he was talking about the new architectural styles of these churches. And I really enjoyed the talk. It was a fascinating talk. He had a lot of photos there, and I thought to myself, I think there'd be a lot of our FoLA members that would enjoy hearing that talk too. And so I said it to Lois Sweck one day. I said, here's a good topic for next year, and here we are. So I'll give you some of the background to Chris as he has given it to me. Chris Burns has had a lifelong interest in history. He was born in Peterborough, South Australia. Who's been to Peterborough? Oh, great place, isn't it? But he grew up at Largs Bay. He studied product design and later education at the University of South Australia, and afterwards worked as a high school design and technology and art teacher at various local schools. He began researching the South Australian architect Chris A. Smith quite seriously in May 2014. And this led him to the University of South Australia Architecture Museum. In 2015, he accepted a short-term contract at the University of South Australia Architecture Museum, which turned into a 5-year apprenticeship in architectural history. While associated with the museum, he was involved in groundbreaking research into born digital archives and digital preservation. He later wrote the first heritage survey examining post-war places of worship in South Australia. This survey for Heritage South Australia identified over 650 new churches built between 1945 and 1990. Arising from this project, numerous modern churches have now been state heritage listed, with more to come. This project also led to his permanent employment at Heritage South Australia as a historian beginning in November 2020. He joined the committee of the Art Deco and Modernism Society of Australia, Adelaide chapter, in 2015, and later became the Adelaide chapter's inaugural vice president. He is also in his second term as the president of the Port Adelaide Historical Society. He enjoys swimming, photography, and of course, researching and writing history. Please join me in welcoming Chris Burns.
Now I'm live, I think. We can all hear me. Thank you for that, Lyle, and thank you, commiserations, Jeff, on that other church that didn't quite make it, but it was a good effort anyway. Thank you all for coming and for navigating the wilds of suburbia to get here. I know it's not your usual venue, but hopefully the content of tonight's talk is engaging enough to make the journey worthwhile. After 1955, most new Lutheran churches in South Australia were designed by one of two Adelaide architects, Eric von Schramek and Norman Drogemuller. Between them, von Schramek and Drogemuller revolutionised Lutheran architecture in South Australia, and in doing so created some of the state's most outstanding modern churches. Tonight's talk will trace the lives and careers of von Schramek and Drogemuller with an emphasis on their churches, and examine their work within the broader context of modern church architecture in South Australia. We'll also meet a man by the name of Roy Drogemuller, a prolific South Australian émigré artist who was responsible, among other things, for the sacred art in the sanctuary of this church. It's a fairly architecture-heavy talk, I must admit, but I will try to balance that with some social history and illustrate some of the more conceptual ideas with everyday examples where possible. I'll be speaking for about an hour with a bit of time for some questions afterwards. So, Before I talk about modern churches, it's helpful to talk about traditional churches to establish some common ground. Oops, there we go. So in 1817, Frederick William III, who was the king of the German state of Prussia, attempted to unite his Protestant citizens through the introduction of a common state liturgy, as you do. It didn't work. People went on worshipping in the ways they always had done, and so in 1834, in frustration, Frederick outlawed traditional Lutheran worship. Broadly speaking, it was kind of a dumb idea. The main outcome was to exacerbate mass immigration already underway because of the economic conditions of the time. Entire villages packed up and headed for the New World. Far from uniting his people, it had quite the opposite effect. Yes? Yes, I will. I'll try to. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, there's Carvel, sorry. One of these villages was a place called Klemzig, in what is now Poland. A man named August Ludwig Christian Carvel was the pastor in Klemzig. This is Pastor Carvel's original church, and for tonight's discussion, the most interesting features are the rectangular floor plan, the square-footed tower, and the spire on the roof of the tower. And these are all features that were later replicated or copied in South Australian Lutheran churches. So Pastor Carvel travelled to London to arrange passage to the United States. While there, he met George Fife Angus, one of the founders of South Australia, and Angus agreed to sponsor the emigration of Carvel's flock to Australia, to South Australia, and they arrived in November-December 1838. This is the German village of Klemzig, as recorded by George Fife Angus, a son of French Angus, a son of George Fife Angus, in about 1845. The first permanent Lutheran settlement in South Australia. This is kind of the main drag down the middle of the town, the village, which looks to be a Strassendorf village with a village plan with buildings on both sides of the street. On the left is what I presume to be the church, and what's really interesting is how similar the church is to the other buildings in the town. The only thing to really set that building apart visually as a place of worship is the belfry on the roof. So Lutheran settlement in South Australia was immediately successful, and it set up a chain of migration that endured into the early 20th century. This process incidentally involved some of my ancestors. Now, the arrival of a separate group of Lutheran migrants led by Pastor Gotthard Daniel Fritsche in October 1841 led to internal conflict, and in 1846 the Lutheran Church in Australia was split over theological differences. This was the main schism, and there were a number of subsequent smaller schisms. The upshot was that many towns in South Australia ended up with two Lutheran places of worship. One of my favourite examples is Nain, west of Norutpa. When you go there today, there are maybe 5 buildings in the town, in the vicinity, and 2 of those are Lutheran churches. And one of these is now privately owned, and you can sort of see one of them sort of just up the street from the other one. The earliest South Australian Lutheran churches did not have towers and spires like the original Klemzig church. These were features that were typically added later when funds became available. This is St Michael's Church in Harndorf, as it was during the 19th century. It's a relatively simple gable-roofed church. No tower at this point, but it does have a belfry at the top like the Klemzig church we saw a moment ago. You'll also notice that the windows are quite tall and narrow, and the arches at the tops of the windows are pointed. And pointed arches were almost exclusively a feature of churches during the 19th century, not typically found in other building types. So by the early 20th century, it was more or less expected or understood that Lutheran churches would or should have a tower, a square-footed tower with a metal-clad spire, or at least that was the aspiration. And it was this feature, the spire, which really became a distinguishing feature of South Australian Lutheran churches. They were not terribly common in churches of other denominations, which established footholds in South Australia. Oops. So I'll briefly introduce tonight's two main protagonists. Eric von Schramek, later Sir Eric von Schramek OAM, was born in Prague, in what is now the Czech Republic, on the 4th of April 1921. He had early ambitions to be an artist and painter, but was redirected towards architecture by his parents, perhaps a wiser choice, a wiser career choice. He undertook a diploma of architectural engineering at the Prague Technical University, followed by postgraduate studies in Munich. After the Second World War, he emigrated to Germany, where he was appointed a town planner in Bavaria. In February 1948, he married Edith Popper, and they migrated to Australia. As migrants, they spent some time at the Bonegilla migrant camp in Victoria, and while there, he designed the camp chapel. He moved to Darwin in 1948, where he was involved in the rebuilding of Darwin, and while there, he after the Japanese bombing, which occurred in World War II. In 1951, he joined Evans, Brewer and Partners in Adelaide, became a director of the firm in 1953. Later, the firm became known as von Schramek and Dawes, with an office in Melbourne Street, North Adelaide. He made regular trips overseas. He was the first Australian to become a member of the American Society of Church Architecture. From 1967 to 1987, he was chairman of the Lutheran Church's Commission on Worship, Department of Church Architecture and Commission on Church Properties. Perhaps one of his best-known churches is the former Morn Methodist Church, opened in 1965, which once stood on the corner of Franklin and Pitt Streets in the city, unfortunately demolished in 2012. However, the building which has been built in its place is actually quite a nice building and continues the mission of the Uniting Church on that site in a kind of a relevant way, so that's rather nice. He retired in 1989 and he died on the 9th of April 2010. Less well known is Norman Roy Drogemuller OAM. Seen here on the left, receiving a Timber Development Association Award. He was born at Lameroo on the 19th of December 1923. His parents were Heinrich Wilhelm Drogemuller and Caroline Emma Pfeiffer. They were married in Light Pass and they moved to Lameroo in about 1910. Norm was the youngest of 8 children and his father was a builder. He built the first St. John's Lutheran Church in Lameroo, seen here. Along with many other men of his generation, Norman served in the Second World War. Prior to enlisting in 1941, his usual occupation was mechanical drafter, and he was currently employed as a labourer in the shell annex of the Islington Railway Workshops. He couldn't drive a car or ride a horse, but on the other hand, he could drive a team of horses, which was potentially a useful skill for a country boy to have. He listed his level of education as intermediate plus intermediate commercial with credit. And incidentally, while studying at the Lameroo School in the late 1930s, he was head prefect and the regular school reporter for the Pinaroo and Border Times, which was the local newspaper. Ultimately, he signed his oath of enlistment in Alice Springs on the 5th of March 1942. Oh, there it is. Here he is. He's quite tall. He's 6'1" or thereabouts. He served on continuous full-time war service with the Citizen Military Service from February 1942 until March 1943, and the AIF from March 1943 until the end of the war in 1946. This included operational service in the Borneo region, and he was discharged on the 26th of June 1946. After the war, he received architectural training under the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme. Here he is on the right while a student at the University of Adelaide in 1950 with some fellow students. In 1952, he married Lorraine Daphne Henschke. They had 3 children, Rob and Michael, who was also an architect and a former colleague of mine, Alison Leslie and Richard James. For much of his career, Norm worked in partnership with Colin Pudney, also with an office in Melbourne Street, North Adelaide. This is the firm's letterhead as it appeared in 1964. He designed over 85 projects for the Lutheran Church of Australia in South Australia and Victoria, including places of worship, schools and community centres. So very busy. As well as, as well as practising as an architect, Norm was a member of the Practice Committee, Royal Australian Institute of Architects from 1962. He attended St Stephen's Church in the city, where he served as steward for over 50 years, in addition to holding a seat on the Church Council. And he also was a member and secretary of the Department of Architecture, Commission on Worship, Lutheran Church of Australia from 1966. So he was very, very busy. In 1999, he was recognised as a Life Fellow of the Royal Australian Institute of Architects, and in 2008 he was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for service to arbitration and mediation, particularly in the areas of architecture and construction and to the community. And he died on the 4th of May 2009. Now, Adelaide has long been known as a city of churches, and this was as true in the years following the Second World War as it was in the 19th century. This is part of the famous Duryea panorama taken in 1875, looking west along Franklin Street. And if you look closely, there are at least 5 churches in this photograph alone, including the original Morn Church on the left with the tall spire. Between 1945 and 1990, over 650 new places of worship were built in South Australia. Most of these places were churches, and most were built during an intensive church building boom which occurred between 1953 and 1966. The Catholic Church built the largest number of new churches in South Australia, over 130, followed by the Lutheran Church in second place with at least 80 new churches, and the Anglican Church third with over 60 new churches. So this graph gives an indication of the scale of construction over time, beginning in 1945. Practically nothing is built before 1952. There's a sudden spike in 1953 when at least 19 new churches were opened. In 1959, 27 new churches were opened, a number that has not been equalled since, but only 6 in 1967, and after that things taper off. A little bit of activity in the 70s, but not nearly as much as before. So what's going on here? Well, after the Second World War, there was a critical shortage of housing. This was a carryover from the Depression, but was exacerbated after the war by the influx of returned soldiers, migrants, and the beginnings of the baby boom. Building materials were scarce, and so the Playford government introduced building controls. Non-essential construction was restricted. This included churches, and that's why so few new churches were built before 1953. To address the housing shortage, the South Australian Housing Trust developed mass housing for rent and for sale. New housing meant new suburbs, and in the case of Elizabeth, an entirely new city built from scratch, and new suburbs and new neighbourhoods, of course, meant new churches. When building restrictions were finally lifted in January 1953, each denomination embarked on ambitious programs of church extension with the goal of planting a new church in each new suburb. Now, just going to skip a little bit here. Here we go. So, we'll get to that. All right, so church attendance increased steadily through the 50s and 60s, driven by migration and the baby boom, and in particular, Sunday school attendance skyrocketed. Now we'll get to that. Prior to the mid-1960s, most South Australians were still nominal Christians, and the churches were still regarded as moral guardians of society. Here we have a leading British preacher, Dr. W.E. Sangster, warning us of some pretty serious moral dangers in the Advertiser. I think that's quite entertaining. And even those parents who were not regular churchgoers themselves believed that a religious education would benefit their children, and so a large proportion of South Australian children attended Sunday school during the 1950s, even if their parents didn't attend church. Meanwhile, one-off events like the Billy Graham Crusade in 1959 also played a role in increasing church attendances, especially in Protestant denominations. Around 250,000 attended the crusade at the Wavell Showgrounds over a fortnight in May of that year, and this single event is said to have breathed new life into many congregations. Catholics were forbidden from attending, but many still went along anyway. So as attendances increased, of course, many established congregations outgrew their small established churches, which were replaced by new buildings. So we had, on one hand, new churches that were brand new, built on new sites, and on the other, we had new churches that replaced existing churches in established neighbourhoods. So, coming back to our graph, what went wrong? What happened in 1967? In Western countries, organised religion experienced a crisis in the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, internationally. This was an international trend. Does anyone remember who arrived in Adelaide on the 12th of June 1964? Yeah, very good. That's right. Actually, not entirely correct. 3/4 of the Beatles arrived in Adelaide on the 12th of June 1964. Ringo had tonsillitis, and so he couldn't make it. But the Beatles managed to draw a larger crowd in a single day than Billy Graham had managed to do over a fortnight 7 years earlier, more popular than Jesus indeed. And while it's not fair perhaps to hold George, Paul and John entirely responsible for the end of the church building boom in South Australia, their visit did signal the beginning of a countercultural revolution which overturned the conservative values of the previous generation. Meanwhile, the teenager emerged in the 1950s as a distinct social group with its own lingo, its own music, its own popular culture, and young people dissatisfied by what they perceived to be irrelevant and outdated institutions, in quotations, soon deserted the churches in large numbers, especially once the Vietnam War began to really heat up. And in particular, many of the children who attended Sunday school during the 50s and 60s did not transition into adult churchgoing. After 1967, the demand for new churches in most denominations largely evaporated, but the story was a little bit different in the Lutheran Church. I'm going to have a glass of water. Bottle of water, really. And that's because, in 1966, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia and the United Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, the two halves of the schism with very similar names just to confuse everyone, were reunified to create the Lutheran Church of Australia. Many congregations amalgamated, meaning there was suddenly a whole lot of redundant church buildings. And, here we are. The income from the sale of these buildings in some cases allowed Lutheran congregations to build new churches, and this was especially common in country areas. And this is why in South Australia we have a large number of really outstanding modern country churches built during the late 60s through the 70s and into the 80s. Many of these churches were designed by Norman Drogemuller. A good example is St Paul's at Balaclava, opened in 1975, as a result of the merger of the local St Bartholomew and Zion congregations. It's an unashamedly modern building. The porch, which we see here, carries a mansard roof. That is a roof with a break that changes direction from sloping to vertical. The roof is clad in deck profile steel. That's where the shape of the steel looks like an electrocardiogram, if you know what that is. It's stronger and stiffer than conventional corrugated steel. The walls are cream face brick being the highest grade of brick you can get. And at the southern end, there is a skillion or sloping roofed tower, which we're going to get to, there we are, with clerestory windows up the top to let daylight into the sanctuary. Floods the sanctuary with daylight. So clearly the churches that were built after the Second World War everywhere were quite different from the traditional churches that had gone before. Broadly, there were three main reasons. The first was the availability of new materials, processes, technologies. The second was an idea that came to dominate architectural thinking after the Second World War, known as the modern movement or modernism. And the third was liturgical change, so changes in the practice of Christian worship. After 1945, new materials, processes and technologies revolutionised the construction industry in South Australia. Many innovations came from wartime mass production and arrived in South Australia after the war via the United States. And these innovations changed forever the detail, finish, furnishing and features of South Australian churches. In terms of structure, that is the frame that holds a building up, the three most important innovations were welded steel as opposed to riveted steel, concrete and laminated timber. So welded steel could be smooth and seamless. We see a little bit of it in this church. Reinforced concrete could be cast in any shape imaginable. I'll talk a little bit about the Emmanuel College later, Emmanuel College Chapel later. And glued laminated timber, which allowed the creation of smooth, seamless, streamlined timber roof trusses. So you can see here in this particular one, the roof trusses are comprised of many narrow strips of timber all glued together to create a seamless curved truss, which is called a portal frame. And the adhesives technology came out of aircraft manufacture in World War II. So these three innovations, steel, concrete and laminated timber, allowed much wider spans. Traditionally, the width of a building was limited by how long a piece of timber you could get, which was in turn limited by how tall the local trees were, right? So these innovations allowed a much greater freedom in creating dramatic shapes and forms and volumes, and because these materials were so flexible, there was a greater tendency to express the structure. So instead of hiding the structure away, architects would deliberately show off the structures of their new churches as features of their designs. This is St. Petri Lutheran Church in Neurupa, and here is the roof supported by laminated timber portal frames. Unfortunately, in this case, after they raised the roof, the adhesive holding these strips of timber together failed and the portal frames delaminated, which was not a good thing, and it was necessary to retrofit a steel structure underneath to keep the roof standing up. In traditional churches, the walls were made of stone or brick, and the walls had to physically support the weight of the roof. So windows tended to be very narrow because whenever you create an opening in a wall, it creates a weak spot. In many modern buildings, the windows only exist. The walls only exist to enclose space. The walls don't serve a structural function. So in this church, they may, but in a lot of modern buildings, the walls don't actually support any weight. And that means you can have a wall made of glass if you want to, which is what we have here in St. Petri's Church, the transept on the right. New structural materials meant it was no longer necessary for walls to be buttressed as it was in traditional church architecture. So here the walls and the corners of the towers are buttressed with piers that stand proud from the walls to give the walls extra strength and to stop them from spreading outwards under the weight of the roof. So it was no longer necessary to do that in the post-war period. Prior to the Second World War, Adelaide was very much a red brick city. In the years after the Second World War, we saw a dramatic diversification in the size, shape, colour and texture of available brick stock. And so we see a few examples here. Cream brick was the staple brick of the post-war period. Clinker brick, which was it's bricks that have been kind of overcooked in the kiln, which traditionally was a waste material, kind of got used a fair bit in the post-war period. And of course, concrete masonry units from 1954 onwards, the much maligned Besser block. Of course, when Besser blocks were first introduced, they were used in houses, they were used in churches, they were used in civic buildings. It was only later they became to be associated with industrial buildings, and they're now regarded as a utilitarian material, and dare I say it, a rather ugly material, but at the beginning this wasn't the case, this wasn't the association. So, modernism originated in Europe after World War I, especially in Germany and the Netherlands. This is the Bauhaus building in Dessau, Germany, which is a very famous early modern building from 1925. Incredibly modern for its time, almost unbelievably modern when compared with a typical modern building from the same year in South Australia. This is the Kelvin building on King William Street. It's the most modern building that Adelaide had to offer in 1925. So it's still quite traditional. Modernism was not a style. Instead, it was claimed it was a philosophy of design and a method of designing. At the core of modernism was the idea that pleasing and appropriate solutions would emerge when design problems were analysed rationally. So the idea is, if you analyse the intended use of a space, the different activities that will take place there, the shape of the site, the orientation of the sun, if you analyse all of these things, there will be an optimum solution to all of those variables, and the optimum solution arrived at through rational analysis will almost automatically be a successful solution. And anything that might get in the way of rational analysis was rejected by modernist architects, and that includes things like decoration, self-expression and symbolism, especially decoration. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, if you wanted something to be decorated, you had to pay someone to do the decoration. That was expensive, and so decoration came to be associated with wealth. And the wealthier you were, the more decoration you could have in your house or your church or your castle or your whatever. Palace of Versailles is a preeminent example of decoration as a marker of wealth taken to its logical extreme conclusion. With the arrival of industrial mass production, the steam engine powered looms, cast iron and so on, suddenly the middle classes could have as much decoration as they wanted, and cheaply, and the working classes too for that matter. The mass-produced cast iron work of the 19th century is a perfect example of new technology enabling the standardised mass production of inexpensive decoration. So things became turned on their head. Decoration came to be seen as a marker of cheapness, and this is perhaps one reason why decoration was rejected by the modernist architects. They believed that decoration was shallow or superficial. Instead of decoration, modernist architects, that beauty would emerge from the natural properties of the materials themselves, such as the grain of timber or the subtle variations in the texture of stone or concrete or brick. During the 19th century, it became common to disguise cheap materials to make them appear more expensive than they really were. So, for example, you might take a relatively inexpensive timber like pine and you would stain it a darker colour to make it appear like mahogany or something of that nature. Modernist architects really despised those kind of practices. They believed that materials should be expressed honestly to their true nature, not disguised as something else. And what we see in a lot of the modernist churches, the timber is the natural colour of the timber. It's not trying to, the pews here, for example, it's Australian oak, and it's not trying to be anything other than Australian oak. Oops. In terms of liturgical change, the key driving force was a movement known as the liturgical movement. The liturgical movement began in the 19th century. It purported to be a return to the practices of the early church. It was most influential in Catholicism, where it led to, culminated in the Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, known as Vatican II, between 1962 and 1965. Vatican II, of course, brought about sweeping changes in the Catholic Church, led to a lot of experimentation in church architecture. So, for example, St Margaret Mary's Church at West Croydon, 1968, with a very innovative hexagonal floor plan. Pews wrapped around the sanctuary to bring the people as close as possible to the altar, and we kind of see that a little bit here in this church. But the impact of the liturgical movement was also felt in churches outside of the Catholic Church, in Anglicanism and to some extent in the Lutheran Church. Followers of the liturgical movement in theology and followers of the modern movement in architecture agreed on key questions of church design and planning. So in particular, they believed that churches should be liturgically functional instead of romantically expressive. From a planning point of view, one of the key things was eliminating the visual separation between the sanctuary and the nave. So traditionally, the sanctuary was quite often located in its own little room almost, behind an archway. Here at the church at Semaphore, it's not the case. The sanctuary and the nave are all one room, and it's the same in this space. The sanctuary and the nave are all part of the same room. Now in Britain, the kind of the epicentre of this discourse on the liturgical movement was a group called the New Churches Research Group, which was established in 1957. And the New Churches Research Group's, I guess, most strident voice was an Anglican priest named Peter Hammond. He wrote a number of highly influential books on church architecture. One of these was Towards a Church Architecture, my very dog-eared personal copy of that book. So Hammond, extremely influential. He discouraged designs for churches based on literal symbolism. So churches shaped like praying hands, or churches shaped like crosses or fish, which he felt were gimmicks, not serious architecture. This one is the US Air Force Academy Chapel in Colorado Springs, and it was criticised by Hammond and others for being too literal an interpretation of praying hands. Hammond also cautioned against the uncritical adoption of fashionable floor plans, such as circles and squares, without considering the intended function of a space. So Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral was criticised for having a circular floor plan, which arguably didn't serve the liturgy because when you're a priest, it's actually rather hard to celebrate Mass in 360 degrees. And finally, Hammond chided those architects who treated church design as what he called an architectural holiday, an escape from the restraints of ordinary design procedure into the less exacting world of fantasy and self-expression. And of course, the French architect Le Corbusier managed to polarise opinions with this rather well-known church built in 1955. Oops. All right. Interestingly, Eric von Schramek took quite a different view to Hammond, and by extension, in some ways, the opposite view to orthodox architectural thinking on modern church architecture. In his own words, he believed that the functional aspects of church design are quite simple. The rest is pure design, inspiration, and love of the subject. He also said the architect identifies him or herself with a building through expression, symbolism, message, and intended purpose. Symbolism and self-expression were anathema to the likes of Peter Hammond and orthodox architectural modernist architects. If you really want to upset a modernist architect in the 1960s, start talking about symbolism, because it really gets them riled up. Von Schramek also says, oops, I think I'm on a line of sight thing with this. There we are. The opportunity for creative design in a building where the function is rather simple is therefore virtually unlimited. He's saying the function of a church is simple, which is almost a heretical statement in the context of the time he was working. Hammond argued the complete opposite. Hammond argued that the function of a church is complex and requires radical rethinking in the modern era. In fact, that was the thesis of his 2 books on church architecture. Diametrically opposed to orthodox modernist architectural thinking. Really interesting. It's not to say that one is right and one is wrong, but it is interesting just how different those two philosophies are. And both philosophies, incidentally, resulted in the creation of some truly amazing churches. In terms of symbolism in Eric von Schramek's work, the best example is undoubtedly the wonderful Straight Gate Lutheran Church in Light Pass. It's a pretty extraordinary building. Light Pass, as some of you may know, is a small settlement just east of Norjutpa. And so you're driving through the vineyards and this incredible radical modern church kind of rears up out of nowhere. It was built as a result of the congregation's decision to replace their small dilapidated church, a 19th century church. And in his memoirs, Eric explained he approached the building committee with some trepidation, but to his vast surprise, the design was accepted unanimously. The tower from the old church was deliberately incorporated into the new design, and according to Sir Eric, the old and the new together symbolised a congregation alive and aggressive, planning for the future whilst respecting and carrying on their traditions and heritage. This is the back of the church. It's a wonderful, wonderful, strange and wonderful building. As far as I know, I think it's great, there's this sort of tail that kicks up at the back of the roof. As far as I know, it's the only South Australian church of that era with a scriptural quotation integrated into the architecture like this. Not just a sign, but part of the built fabric of the church. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and it is, "Enter ye in at the straight gate." Most likely, von Schramek was inspired by St John's Lutheran Church in Bundaberg, designed in 1958, where the front of the church is almost literally an open Bible. I think, there we have that quotation on the front. And unusually at Straight Gate, symbolism was the primary determinant of the form of the church. So, "Enter ye in at the straight gate" is interpreted in the architecture, where a tall, broad, cream brick facade, which is very wide and tall, serves to emphasise the narrowness of the main entry door. Once inside, the ceiling of the worship space slopes downwards, and the walls are angled inwards towards the sanctuary, as if funneling the congregation towards the altar, towards the narrow way, if you like. Another innovation was the sawtooth side walls, punctuated by windows, to let light in without blinding everyone in the congregation with the glare. It was quite clever. Reflecting on his life's work, Sir Eric considered Straight Gate to be his most progressive design. And Straight Gate was innovative in a statewide context across all denominations, not just within the Lutheran Church. Highly influential, and we see the legacy of Straight Gate here in this church in the shape of the nave, with its walls converging towards the sanctuary, and some of the other details. So by the time the building boom began in 1953, most Protestant denominations had moved away from traditional church architecture. So they'd abandoned buttresses, pointed arches, fluted mouldings, and applied decoration while embracing the possibilities of new materials, processes and technologies. This is Flinders Park Church of Christ, opened in 1956, now sadly demolished, but it's a good example of a modern church. In terms of its roof shape, materials, features and details, it's not dissimilar from the surrounding housing stock. A low-pitched roof, Carry Gully stone on the front, built-in planter boxes. It's kind of grounded in its suburban environment. In contrast, the architecture of many post-war Lutheran churches remained quite traditional. St Paul's Lutheran Church at Truro, built around the same time as Flinders Park, 1956. And okay, it's cream brick, but in terms of plan, elevation, features, it's a very traditional church. Pitched roof, pointed arches, a rose window even, and the nave and the sanctuary are planned as separate spaces with their own separate roofs as well. There were a number of churches like this. There was one at Waikerie, 1953, St Paul's at Barmera, 1958. And in South Australia, it was Sir Eric von Schramek who finally broke this pattern. Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Archer Street, North Adelaide, was the first modern Lutheran church to be built in South Australia, opening in 1955. It still has a gable roof, but it's quite a low-pitched gable, and it has these kind of pylons on the front of the church that resemble traditional buttressing, but they're sloping upwards. They get wider at the top, which structurally is actually the complete opposite of what a buttress wall does. So he's almost playing a game with traditional expectations and turning them on their head. The hood over the entrance, that's the next one. The hood over the entrance is a slab of concrete. It's cantilevered out, it's floating in space with no obvious means of support. And the whole front of that church between the pylons is made of glass. It's a very lightweight structure. It was also the first church that Sir Eric designed in South Australia. It spawned numerous imitators. This is Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Kadina, 1961, designed by Norman Drogemuller, one of his early churches, and it's almost a carbon copy of the church in Archer Street. Now, as I mentioned earlier, so prior to 1966 there were 2 Lutheran synods in Australia, and a glance through the pages of the Australian Lutheran and the Lutheran Herald, which were the 2 weekly publications of those synods, indicates that by about 1960 both were similarly progressive in their architectural expressions. They were around about the same kind of place. Eric von Schramek did work for both synods. Prior to 1966, most of Norman Drogemuller's work was for the UECLA, the UCLA, of which he was also a member. Von Schramek was designing churches in South Australia from 1956 until about 1972. Drogemuller was designing churches throughout the 70s and into the mid-1980s. And one of his last, I believe, was St Mark's at Underdale, which opened in 1986, which was just before I was born. So he was working for quite a bit longer. This is St Paul's at Ramco in the Riverland, opened in 78. It's a local landmark on a bend of the Ramco Road, perched on the edge of Ramco Lagoon. The brickwork is very crisp and clean. It's machine-made brick by this point, so the brickwork is very regular. This is the interior. Originally, the intention was to have floor-to-ceiling windows on that left-hand side with a view out over the lagoon, but in the end, the congregation decided that privacy was more important than the view. The roof is a deck profile steel again, quite a thick fascia around the edges, so where sort of what would be the guttering traditionally, and quite shallow eaves. We see, as we see in a lot of Drogemuller's churches, especially the late churches, there's a metal-clad spire on the roof, which is a reference to the characteristic metal spires of traditional Lutheran churches. Tall, narrow windows around the perimeter, also harking back to traditional churches. And St Paul's is known affectionately by some Riverland locals as the Pizza Hut for its red face brick and evocative roofline. I quite like that. I think that's a fantastic church, that one. St John's Udunda, 1980, another fairly late Drogemuller church. Looking down on the roof, it's a stretched octagon, which is kind of pleated. It's actually 2 gables that cross over perpendicular to one another. Again, very crisp, regular brickwork, tall, narrow windows. Once again, on the roof, a spire clad in deck profile steel. These features are really the hallmarks of Drogemuller's work, and it's pretty easy to pick a Drogemuller church once you've learned what to look for. Here's another one, St Peter's Lutheran Church in Dimbulla, another typical Drogemuller church. spire on the roof again. So during the 1960s, there was a bit of a debate about the lighting of modern churches, substantially. I went there on a Sunday morning back in 2019. The power was out because a car had conveniently crashed into the Stobie pole outside, and so the congregation was conducting the service by candlelight. Everyone had a little candle, and they were sort of reading the Bible by candlelight. So under normal circumstances, artificial light is used to illuminate that space. It's a very controlled, orchestrated lighting scheme. And I think it's also orientated in such a way that on Christmas morning a beam of light comes in through the window and lands on the altar. It's quite wonderful. Another was St Paul's at Glenelg, opened in 1961. Again, similar story, tall narrow windows shaded by Besser blocks, downlights over the gallery, also some custom-made pendant light fittings on one side to kind of balance out those columns on the other side. In the sanctuary there were 3 mirrored incandescent lamps that were concealed from the congregation and aimed at the sanctuary. So this light source was designed to light up the sanctuary and throw a shadow on the sanctuary wall into relief from the cross to bring that into contrast. The exterior was floodlit by sodium vapour lamps with gold fluorescent tubes in each section of the tower. And finally, a 300-watt narrow beam spotlight illuminating the roof-mounted cross. Nighttime lighting of church exteriors is kind of analogous to nighttime lighting of commercial premises during that era. Served a similar function to advertise the presence of the church in the streetscape with the intention of drawing passers-by inside. Innovative as he was, Sir Eric was not without his critics. Between 1952 and 1971, the University of Melbourne published a monthly newsletter called Cross Section for architects and builders. Its inaugural editor was Robin Boyd, Australian architect and a highly influential voice within the Australian architectural profession. It goes without saying that with Boyd involved, it was a fairly radical kind of publication. And von Schramek's Hamilton Park Methodist Church of 1962 was ridiculed in cross-section. They refer to it as a cliché festoon confection of a church. How do you like that? As I said, it was a cliché festoon confection. As I said, it was a radical publication. It does look a little bit like a wedding cake, I suppose, but I quite like that one too. Hamilton Park was an octagonal church. Sir Eric quite liked designing octagonal churches when given the opportunity. Morn Church, of course, was an octagonal church. Another was Zion Lutheran Church at Glynde, opened in 72. Part of a master plan for a church and hall, never actually completed. And he picked the octagon because he felt that the worship space appears small while seating a large congregation, and so an intimate feeling is created by the short distance which separates each worshipper from the altar. So we can see in this plan the herringbone arrangement of the pews in the space, almost gathered around the altar. And this was one of the ideals of the liturgical movement, which bore fruit in the Protestant churches, this idea of bringing people as close to the altar as possible. Another octagonal church is the wonderful Emmanuel Lutheran College Chapel, one of South Australia's most outstanding examples of so-called brutalist architecture. Now, by the way, brutalism was never about being brutal. It actually comes from a French term, béton brut. Hope I got that right, Leonard. Yeah. Which simply means essentially raw or rough concrete. And the name brutalism originated as a term of criticism, and like many similar terms, it was eventually embraced and used by those architects. In this church, the concrete parts of the building were poured in situ. So there was a timber formwork, creating a mould into which the concrete was poured, and the boards used to create the formwork were deliberately selected and positioned so that when the formwork was taken away, the grain and the texture of the timber would be left behind permanently in the concrete as a feature. It creates quite interesting shadows, especially where the surfaces are curved. This is a great building. It's a deliberately fortress-like structure, inspired by the Lutheran hymn, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God. It has these wonderful, tall, narrow openings reminiscent of loopholes for shooting arrows through. It's really quite interesting. Above the altar is a large metal sculpture by South Australian émigré artist Stan Stojakovsky. And these pictures, incidentally, were taken by my colleague Stuart Simons, who has a business called Modernist Adelaide, and he runs regular walking tours of the Adelaide CBD, taking in some of the wonderful modernist and brutalist architecture that our city has to offer. So I encourage you to check that out as well. Some other Drogemuller churches, Trinity Lutheran Church at Blythe, the church that lost its roof, or part of its roof. It happened in a storm a few years ago. All of his churches were quite different in terms of plan and roof shape. So this one has an arrow-shaped plan with a sloping wedge-shaped roof, with a wonderful steel-framed tower with these very delicate leaves of brick infill at right angles to each other, which seem to float in space. So that brings us to this church. Norman Drogemuller was also, of course, the architect for this church, one of the reasons we're here tonight. The first Lutheran services in McGill were held in the local institute from the 1930s, late 1930s. The first Pilgrim Evangelical Lutheran Church was opened in 1954, which is the small building which is just behind us. The congregation grew throughout the 1960s, and in November 1968, the congregation appointed Norman Drogemuller to prepare a master plan for a new church complex. A fundraising appeal was launched in November 1970 at a Building Appeal Fellowship tea, and on 4th of October 1970, the congregation accepted the tender of E.F. Marshall and Son of $50,000 for the whole project. Imagine doing this for $50,000 today. A groundbreaking ceremony was held on the 1st of November 1970. Foundations were poured the following day, and a foundation stone was unveiled on the 14th of February 1971, and this church was opened later that year. So again, some typical features of a Drogemuller church that we see here: face brick walls, tall narrow windows, an unconventional plan shape. In this case, it's an irregular hexagon. Designed to seat 250, would you believe, in the nave, and another 80 in the gallery above. Of course, all the timber is Australian oak or something quite similar to Australian oak. And by the way, the green carpet, this particular shade was sometimes known as liturgical green, and it was used in many churches of the era because the colour was quite good at concealing dirt. So there you go. Now, before I close tonight, I have been asked to speak a little on a South Australian artist named Wojtek Marek. He was the artist responsible for some of the sacred artwork in this church, including the risen Christ on the wall behind me, the baptismal font lid, which is just over here, the candle holders and vases. Protestant denominations have always had a pretty minimalist approach to sacred art. Prior to the Second World War, the opposite was true in the Catholic Church. Prior to that time, Catholic religious art was typically mass-produced and purchased from a liturgical art supplier. Adelaide's sole importer was a firm called Pellegrini's, and Pellegrini's stocked a range of mass-produced and inexpensive sacred art. A lot of it was cast in plaster, and it all sort of came out of the same mould, and the statues were given different colours depending on which saint they were, that kind of thing. The inexpensiveness of mass-produced sacred art meant that Catholic congregations easily installed as much sacred art as they desired, and Catholic churches soon became over-decorated with a profusion of art and statuary. This all changed during the 1960s, following Vatican II, which we heard about earlier. After Vatican II, Catholic churches were required to declutter their sanctuaries, with the emphasis shifting to having a smaller number of high-quality sacred artworks specifically commissioned for that particular church. And so, there's some traditional sacred art, sort of very literal sort of figure. And so Wouter Marek and his contemporaries offered a new and exciting way of presenting sacred imagery, which parish priests saw as an ideal way of modernising. Wouter Marek was easily South Australia's most prolific religious artist during the post-war period, and he's remembered for his distinctive and original sacred art. He was born in 1919 in Prague, in what is now the Czech Republic. He apprenticed in metal engraving. He studied at the Prague Academy of Fine Arts and established an atelier as a freelance sculptor, winning prizes for his work. With his brother Dusan, he fled the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia and arrived in South Australia as a displaced person in 1948. Between 1956 and 1960, he was a lighthouse keeper on Kangaroo Island, and during this time he experienced a religious epiphany, which deepened his Catholic faith and had a decisive impact on his future artistic output. He disliked conventional mass-produced sacred imagery, religious statuary, which he described as having benevolent saccharine expressions. Instead, Marek attempted to demonstrate the infinite depths of love, not something simply sweet but immensely profound. My colleague, Dr. Ralph Boddy, who used to be at the Art Gallery of South Australia, has observed that in Marek's sculpture, emotion is conveyed through gesture rather than impassioned expression. The faces of his figures exude a calm reserve without appearing aloof. His work blended surrealist, Byzantine and Romanesque styles. His preferred materials were square and round section, welded steel rod and beaten copper. He also employed newly available materials, including perspex and even a special type of gold leaf developed for satellites. So really quite innovative. And the story goes that he was working in a factory producing steel rod used to make shopping trolleys, basically, and because skilled migrants were brought to Australia to contribute to the manufacturing industry. And he said that when he first cut, shaped and welded this steel rod, he felt that he'd finally found the material that he'd been looking for his whole life. He realised he could express exactly what he wanted to express artistically in what is really a very simple and humble material. And what he manages to express here, really, with a handful of lines of just 3 different line weights, is really quite incredible. St Margaret Mary's Church at West Croydon was opened in 1968, and this was one of maybe 2 or 3 churches where Wouter Marek was commissioned to create all of the sacred art for the church, and there's quite a bit of it. We can see some of those beaten copper things there in green, and all of the marble things in white there too were designed and made by him. Most of his work was created in his backyard workshop, and this wonderful larger-than-life risen Christ on the wall of the sanctuary at St Margaret Mary's was so large that it spilled out into the backyard. And Marek's son Ivan tells me that he and his sister and his mother and various neighbours were all enlisted to help put this piece together. In 1969, after creating artworks for Holy Cross Catholic Church at Goodwood, including the red and orange perspex cross on the roof, here on the roof lantern, Marek was awarded a Churchill Fellowship and spent 4 months travelling through Africa, Europe and the United States, visiting churches and viewing liturgical, historical and contemporary art. In Britain, Basil Spence, the architect for the new Coventry Cathedral, described Marek's work as outstanding and expressed a desire to work with Marek on a future hypothetical church project, which is pretty much the highest praise you can get, I think, for a church artist. Sadly, this was not to be. In 1973, he was badly injured in a car accident, which led to permanent brain damage and limited his use of the right side of his body. So he was able to continue working for a few more years with the help of family and friends, but finally retired in 1978. In 1997, he was honoured by Pope John Paul II with a papal blessing for his outstanding contribution to religious art in Australia, and he died in 1999. So the works that Drogemuller created for this church include the risen Christ on the wall behind me, in beaten copper with a black oxide patina, polished highlights and red enamel, lacquered, and it also has a welded steel rod overlay over the top. The baptismal font lid in beaten copper, also with a black oxide patina and polished highlights, lacquered. Two candle holders, which don't, there they are behind me, on the altar, and two vases, which I couldn't find, but I'm sure they're around somewhere, all in the same materials as the font lid. Now, Drogemuller's children, Olga and Ivan, have created a wonderful website showcasing their father's work. They've been visiting the churches, chapels and schools that are home to Drogemuller's work all over Australia. They've documented 42 installations in various churches where his work can be found today. So that more or less brings me to the end of tonight's talk. Homework for the week is to check out the Drogemuller website and have a look at some of those wonderful artworks. And by the way, there will be a test. There will be a test on all of this next Friday. So I think we'll open it up to questions at this point. I think we've got. Do we have a? Do we want to sort of do a Jerry Springer and take the microphone down?
Excuse me, walking around here, if you want to record it, we need to...
Thank you very much for this evening's talk. I've been really looking forward to it. I built churches with both the architects you were talking tonight. I was a fifth-year medical student and a member of North Adelaide Church, and they were building the new building. And one of the members of the council resigned. So Pastor Hartman said, "Morris, you can come along, you know all about this." I said, "Oh, yes." Anyway, so I had that experience with being with a person and seeing the church being built. And then later I went to Kadina, and the building they had there was falling to bits. And so we decided to build a new church up there. And one of the members said, "Have you got any ideas about a good church?" I said, "Well, you can go down to North Adelaide and have a look." And so they came back and said, "That's exactly what we want." So that's why they're a bit like unequal twins. And so I'm very much involved with that as well. And it's been a very great experience. The roof was pulled down by 2 feet to save £2,000. And so we got the church built for £11,000. And then we wanted to pay off the church, and we've got some fairly wealthy farmers in York Peninsula, and the Methodists had decided to do their new building and use it as a memorial for the last war. So I said, well, why not? And then they can have tax-deductible compliments from the farmers. Anyway, the building was paid for fairly easy, but thank you very much.
That was Dr. Morris. Anybody else? Yes?
Thank you very much, Chris. So in relation to the artist Drogemuller, who was obviously a Catholic, was it often that he produced art for other religious denominations like the Lutherans, or is this a particular example?
Live again? Oh, I'm live again, good. He did some for other denominations, so depending on who commissioned him. So I think the first was a church in Berry, Anglican church, St Albans in Berry, which has just incidentally been sold. And so the artworks in that church have the artwork, oh, there I'm back again. The artworks in that church have been collected incidentally by Aquinas College, so they're safe. It just depended on who was commissioning. So he did quite a lot of stuff for the Anglicans, because of course they were a bit more into liturgical art than say the Methodists. I'm just trying to think if there are any sort of other Lutheran churches that have Drogemuller stuff Probably the website would tell me. Let's have a look. I'm sure there are some others. Oh, well, certainly there's a church at Woodville, which is a migrant church, and that's got it's on Woodville Road. It's a Ukrainian Catholic church, and that has some Wojciech works on the front. So it just depended on who commissioned him, really, and he was quite happy to design for anyone, really. Yeah.
Chris?
Do you know who's responsible for the sanctuary furniture here?
I'd love to know.
Yeah, it's Milton Peach. I was chairman of the building committee with Norm Drogemuller on this particular church, and it had some fairly interesting details which the committee actually went through in a lot of detail. And regarding the symbol there, it was in conjunction with Norm, but a lot of it came from the committee people. And the reason it is like it is that we did not want to have a cross or a crucifix, because that is the dead Lord. We wanted a risen Lord, but we wanted him risen off the cross. And then we went out and actually found Marek. We went down to, is it Torrens Road down there? I can recall that. And that was a result, and we were very happy with that. The furniture, that was pretty well all designed by Norm Drogemuller for this church. And the green carpet was a very controversial point. It should have been Lutheran red, and it wasn't very happy actually at that point in time. And I can remember quite a lot of prayer was given to this, and the meeting finally decided fairly smoothly that it would be green because it matched with the rest of the design. Thank you.
Okay.
Just for interest, the Eric von Schramek's interests also went to Papua New Guinea. Got a few Papua New Guinea people here, missionaries, former missionaries. At Martin Luther Seminary in Lae, he has that octagonal shape with the centre spire, but also incorporated the Papua New Guinea features in the seating and the altar. In fact, the altar that is in the centre of the church, and all the seats are right around. We've got a few people who have been connected with, and it's in the centre of the campus as well.
Thank you. Anybody else?
If I can just be activated again, I'll just make a little point about the risen Christ is quite interesting, because that was, in a way, something that came out of the liturgical movement in the Catholic Church. There was more of an emphasis on the risen Christ as opposed to, as you said, the dead Christ. It was sort of a thing. So, and that was part of that progression, I think, that happened, that has obviously had an impact here and in other places outside of the Catholic Church too, which is really interesting.
My name is John Woodside. I'm a structural engineer. Possibly one of the few people in this room who's worked with both Norman Drogemuller and Sir Eric von Schramek. I just want to tell you a couple of funny little stories about both of them. I didn't do much work with Norman, but in latter years he played golf with me at the Grange Golf Club. And in fact, he designed the golf club, and the committee decided to update it and cover all his face brickwork. And I was on the committee, and he wasn't very happy with me, but we decided we wouldn't discuss the matter when we played golf and left it at that. The second thing I wanted to just tell the audience about was Sir Eric von Schramek. I came to Adelaide in 1977 and worked for a firm called John Connell Associates, and their office was in Melbourne Street, and Sir Eric was one of our best clients. In fact, we helped him design most of his commercial buildings. We didn't do any of his church buildings for some reason, but we always did his commercial work. I'd only just been in Adelaide a little while,
and Ian Gregg, who was my boss, had been down to see Sir Eric, and Sir Eric was gathering together a wine cellar, and he bought all of his wine from Darrenberg Wine, and Ian was a bit of a wine buff, and he said, Sir Eric, you really need to have a variety from different ones. So Eric, quick as a flash, said, Ian, you'll take a couple of dozen, won't you? So Ian came back to the office and said, John, you've got a dozen wine, here it is, and you owe me so much and all the rest of it. And a week later, it won the Adelaide prize in the wine festival as the best wine. So Eric wasn't terribly happy. But he was a good architect to work with, and we enjoyed the work, and we did some fantastic jobs with buildings like the SGIC, moving that building. We were heavily involved in that, so yeah.
I think, you know, I've got one over here. I'll just say, I mean, this is
One
sort of...
more question, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, tonight's talk is really only a scratching of the surface of the work of both of them, and in particular, Norman Drogemuller. I haven't had as much time to do as much on him as I would have liked to have done. There's a hell of a lot more to, you know, to learn about, as far as a lot more work to be done on Norman in particular.
Thank you, Chris. Very interesting. One of my favourite churches design-wise is, I think it's a symbolism, I don't know who did it, is the Ark at Salisbury. Yeah.
Is that, sorry?
The Ark.
The Lutheran Church at Salisbury is called the Ark.
Right. I'm just trying to picture it. I probably know it. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Okay, well, we might close it off here now and formally, and you can still speak to Chris supper time. So I'll ask Helen Schubert, who's a member here at McGill, and also a life member of our organisation, to move a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a very interesting talk covering a wide landscape of architecture and social change. It was very interesting that you talked about the Beatles. That was most unexpected. As unexpected as the Palace at Versailles. But this has really enriched our perspective on things tonight, and we thank you very much for that. We're especially pleased to have you all here at McGill. I've been jumping up and down in committee meetings hoping that this would happen sometime along the way. Even though our pews are not all that comfortable, we have air conditioning, we have good lighting, we have gone past the dark ages of North Adelaide, and you've come into the light tonight, and I hope you've enjoyed that experience. We will adjourn later to the old church, which is now our church hall, for supper, but that was a very humble building. This is a joy to be in, especially because we can see each other, we can look across and see each other, see who's here this Sunday, exchange glances sometimes during the sermon, if something is said that's a little controversial, and the narthex, the area that's between the church and the old church and this modern church is also a very well used space. So if we don't all fit in the hall, the old church, you're welcome to spill over into the narthex, which is not air conditioned and is a little bit chilly tonight, but just the same. So thank you very much for coming here and for enlightening us in many surprising ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. You would have noticed that right at the beginning of his presentation he had some pictures of the main church, and I'm a member of NAME, and the church was built in 1856. It was built by a local farmer, built with local stone. It wouldn't have had a plan. It doesn't have a foundation. The foundation is a row of stones just below ground level, and it's a stone wall building. The walls of the original church are still there. It's been replastered for the centenary. It has no reinforcing in the walls, and it has no cracks. So that's not too bad for an old church, is it? And when it was reworked in 1956 for the centenary, one of the doors was closed off with bricks, and now we've got salt dampness in that area where the bricks were, but the old stone is still going well. And so we've got to thank Chris for what he did at NAME, but the outcome wasn't really what we wanted. But it was a very comprehensive assessment of a very old church in the Lutheran church system. So thank you very much tonight, and we invite you all to stay for supper, and then also speak to Chris if you want to. And as I mentioned earlier, the von Schramek books are available at the foyer for the discounted price tonight of $20. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next month. It'll be at North Adelaide again. Thank you. Safe travelling home. Unfortunately for me, living in the country, the price of petrol is not really that cheap at the moment, is it?